The autumn wind carried the sound of the auctioneer's voice across the dusty parking lot of the Millbrook County Fairgrounds. But Marcus Henley wasn't there for livestock or farm equipment. He stood at the back of a different kind of auction, one that would change not just his life, but the heart of an entire community in ways no one could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The October sun cast long shadows across the Henley Ranch as Marcus walked the fence line, checking for breaks in the wire that separated his struggling cattle operation from the encroaching wilderness. Each step reminded him of the weight pressing down on his shoulders. Mortgage payments 3 months behind, feed bills stacking up like autumn leaves, and cattle prices that hadn't recovered from the summer drought. At 52, Marcus had the weathered hands of a man who'd spent his entire adult life working the land his grandfather had settled in 1923. The Henley Ranch had once been a source of pride in Cedar Valley, Montana, sprawling across 800 acres of prime grazing land with a reputation for raising some of the finest Angus cattle in the state. Now, with only 60 head remaining and creditors circling like vultures, Marcus wondered if he'd be the generation that lost it all. The ranch house, a 2-story structure built from local timber and stone, stood as a monument to better times. Its wraparound porch sagged slightly on the east side, and several of the upstairs windows were boarded up to keep the heat from escaping during the harsh Montana winters. Inside, empty rooms echoed with memories of the family that had once filled them. His wife, Sarah's laughter in the kitchen, his daughter Emma's footsteps racing up and down the stairs, the warm conversations around the dinner table that had made even the hardest days bearable. Sarah had passed away 4 years earlier, from cancer, a battle that had drained not just their emotional reserves, but their financial ones as well. Emma, now 23 and living in Seattle, worked as a nurse and sent what money she could. But Marcus refused to let his daughter sacrifice her future for his failing present. He'd told her the ranch was doing fine, that he didn't need help. But the truth was becoming harder to hide with each passing month. The nearest neighbor, old Tom Bradshaw, lived 7 miles down the county road. He'd stopped by the previous week with an offer to buy the ranch. Not for development, he'd assured Marcus, but to add the grazing land to his own operation. The offer was fair, even generous considering the circumstances, but accepting it would mean admitting defeat. It would mean breaking a promise Marcus had made to his grandfather on his deathbed, a vow to keep the land in the family no matter what. Marcus had grown up hearing stories of the early days when his grandfather had arrived, with nothing but determination and a handful of cattle. The old man had survived blizzards that killed entire herds, drought years that turned the pastures to dust, and the Great Depression that claimed so many other ranches. He'd built something lasting, something worth passing down. Now Marcus felt the weight of potentially being remembered as the one who let it all slip away. The morning routine had become a study in making do with less. Marcus rose before dawn, not because the work demanded it as it once had, but because sleep had become elusive. The coffee was weaker than he preferred, stretched to make the can last another week. The truck, a 1998 Ford that had seen better decades, required a specific combination of prayer and mechanical persuasion to start on cold mornings. The cattle, fewer in number but no less demanding, still needed hay and water, still required the daily attention that had once been shared among 3 hired hands. Walking through the barn, Marcus remembered when every stall was occupied, when the sound of cattle filled the air from dawn to dusk. Now the empty spaces seemed to amplify every footstep, every creak of the old timbers. The equipment shed held rusted remnants of more prosperous times. A combine harvester that hadn't run in 5 years, a hay baler with parts worth more as scrap metal than farm equipment. The town of Cedar Valley, population 1,147, sat nestled in the valley floor 15 miles from the ranch, connected by a two-lane highway that wound through pine forests and across streams that ran clear and cold even in the driest summers. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks, lined with buildings that had weathered decades of boom and bust cycles. The hardware store, Miller's Feed and Supply, had been in the same family for 3 generations. The diner, Rosie's Place, served coffee, strong enough to wake the dead, and pie that drew people from neighboring counties. Everyone in Cedar Valley knew everyone else's business, and Marcus was acutely aware that his struggles weren't exactly secret. The sympathetic looks at the post office, the carefully worded inquiries about how things were going, the way conversations stopped when he entered a room, all of it confirmed that his neighbors understood the situation, even if they were too polite to address it directly. Dr. Elizabeth Carver, who ran the only medical practice in town, had been Sarah's closest friend. She'd stopped by the ranch several times since the funeral, ostensibly to check on Marcus's health, but really to offer support in the way that small-town people do, indirectly, with concern disguised as casual conversation. She'd mentioned that he looked thin, that stress was written in the lines around his eyes, that maybe he needed to consider what Sarah would have wanted for him. The conversation that changed everything began on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of October. Marcus had driven into town for supplies he couldn't afford, hoping to stretch his credit at Miller's Feed and Supply for another month. The morning frost had painted the valley in silver, and the cottonwoods along the creek had turned the golden yellow that signaled winter's approach. Rosie's Place was buzzing with unusual activity when Marcus parked outside. Through the large front windows, he could see a crowd gathered around. Several tables, heads bent over official-looking documents. The conversation was more animated than typical for a Tuesday morning, punctuated by the kind of gestures that suggested something significant was happening. Inside, the warmth carried, the familiar sense of bacon grease and strong coffee, but the atmosphere was charged with an energy Marcus hadn't felt in town for years. Mayor Patricia Gonzalez, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a reputation for getting things done, stood at the center of the gathering, holding a folder thick with papers. "The state says we have 2 weeks to organize everything," she was saying as Marcus approached the counter. "The foster care system is completely overwhelmed, and they're asking communities to step up however they can." Rosie Henderson, the diner's owner and operator for the past 30 years, poured Marcus his usual black coffee without being asked. She was a woman who remembered everyone's preferences and most of their troubles, dispensing both with equal efficiency. "What's all the commotion about?" Marcus asked, nodding toward the crowd. Rosie's expression grew serious. "States organize emergency placement auctions for kids who've been removed from homes. Systems so backed up they're asking rural communities to help place children with families willing to take them in. It's unusual, but desperate times and all that." The concept was foreign to Marcus, but as he listened to the conversations around him, the picture became clearer. The state had identified several dozen children who needed immediate placement, some from homes where neglect or abuse had been discovered, others who had been orphaned by various circumstances. The traditional foster care system was stretched beyond capacity, and smaller communities were being asked to organize local placement efforts. Dr. Carver appeared at his elbow, her medical bag in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. "It's heartbreaking, Marcus. Some of these children have been living in temporary shelters for months. The state figures small communities might offer more stability than the overcrowded urban system." The auction concept, she explained, wasn't about buying and selling children. It was about matching families with children who needed homes. Prospective families would be pre-screened and approved, then participate in a process where they could commit to providing homes for specific children. The state would provide financial support and services, but the communities would provide the stability and care that had been lacking. Marcus found himself drawn into the conversation despite having no intention of participating. The logistics were complex. Background checks, home inspections, financial evaluations. The timeline was compressed, with the actual placement event scheduled for the following Saturday at the county fairgrounds. Families interested in participating had less than a week to complete the approval process. "We need more families," Mayor Gonzalez announced to the room. "The state is sending us profiles for 37 children, ranging in age from infants to teenagers. We have 12 families approved so far, but that's not nearly enough." The number hit Marcus unexpectedly. 37 children without homes, without the security and love that he'd taken for granted when Emma was growing up. He thought about the empty rooms in his ranch house, about the silence that filled the spaces where family conversations once echoed. As the crowd began to disperse, people returning to their daily routines with new purpose, Marcus remained at the counter, staring into his coffee cup. The rational part of his mind catalogued all the reasons why he couldn't possibly consider taking in a child: financial instability, uncertain future, the very real possibility that he might lose the ranch within months. But another part of his mind, a part that had been dormant since Sarah's death, began to stir. The ranch house had been built for a family. The bedrooms upstairs had been designed for children, with windows that looked out over pastures where young voices had once carried on summer evenings. Emma's old room remained exactly as she'd left it when she moved to Seattle, a shrine to a childhood that seemed both distant and immediate. Dr. Carver sat down beside him, her presence both comforting and challenging. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. The question seemed to touch something deeper than conscious thought, something connected to the promises he'd made to Sarah during her final weeks. She'd worried about him being alone, about the ranch becoming a prison of memories rather than a home filled with purpose. "I don't know what I'm thinking," he finally admitted. "The ranch is barely surviving. I can't even take care of myself properly, let alone a child. Sometimes taking care of someone else is exactly what we need to take care of ourselves," Dr. Carver said gently. "Besides, you're stronger than you think. You survived losing Sarah. You've kept the ranch operating despite everything working against you. That takes a kind of strength that can't be taught." The afternoon passed in a blur of mundane tasks. Picking, upfeed, checking on supplies, avoiding the deeper implications of the morning's conversation. But as Marcus drove home through the gathering dusk, the idea had begun to take root. The ranch house loomed ahead, its windows dark and unwelcoming, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine lights in those windows again, to picture warmth returning to rooms that had grown cold with disuse. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That evening, Marcus sat on the front porch, despite the October chill, looking out over land that had shaped his entire life. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already touched with snow, and the first stars were becoming visible in the clear Montana sky. Somewhere in his heart, he could almost hear Sarah's voice, not the weakened whisper of her final days, but the strong, clear tone that had guided him through decades of marriage. She would have wanted him to help, he realized. Sarah had always been the one to bring home stray animals, to volunteer for church committees, to organize fundraisers for families in need. She would have seen those 37 children as 37 opportunities to make a difference, and she would have expected him to find a way to be part of the solution. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like a recognition of something that had already been decided. Marcus would go to the placement event on Saturday. He would offer his home, his heart, and whatever future he could provide to a child who needed both. The ranch that had once seemed like a burden might become once again a place where life could flourish. Standing up from the porch steps, Marcus looked back at the house that had sheltered 3 generations of his family. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of making it ready to shelter another generation, not his own blood perhaps, but family nonetheless. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him, carrying the weight of possibility in a life that had recently held only the certainty of loss. Wednesday morning arrived with an unexpected urgency that surprised Marcus. The application process for becoming an approved placement family required a level of scrutiny he hadn't anticipated. By 8 o'clock, he was seated across from Janet Morrison, the social worker who had driven up from Billings to conduct home evaluations for prospective families in Cedar Valley. Janet was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the efficient manner of someone who had seen too much sadness in her professional life. She carried a clipboard thick with forms and a laptop that seemed to contain detailed requirements for every aspect of child placement. The kitchen table, which had hosted countless family meals during happier times, now served as the staging area for what felt like the most important interview of Marcus's life. The financial disclosure is just the beginning, Janet explained, sliding a multi-page document across the table. We need employment verification, medical records, character, references, and a complete background check. Under normal circumstances, this process takes 6 to 8 weeks. We're trying to compress it into 4 days. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he reviewed the paperwork. The financial section seemed designed to eliminate anyone who wasn't financially secure, with requirements for steady income, adequate savings, and proof of long-term stability. His bank statements told a story of barely making ends meet, of creative juggling between creditors, of a man one emergency away from losing everything. I have to be honest with you, Mrs. Morrison, Marcus said, setting down the pen he'd been holding. The ranch is struggling. I'm behind on mortgage payments, and I can't guarantee financial stability beyond the next few months. Janet studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. Tell me about the ranch. How long has it been in your family? For the next hour, Marcus found himself sharing the history of the Henley Ranch in more detail than he'd discussed with anyone since Sarah's death. He talked about his grandfather's vision, the generations of cattle that had grazed these pastures, the way the land had shaped his understanding of responsibility and commitment. He spoke about Sarah's battle with cancer, the medical bills that had devastated their savings, and his determination to honor the promises he'd made to previous generations. The state provides monthly support for placement families, Janet said, when he finished. It's not a fortune, but it covers basic expenses for the child's care. More importantly, we're looking for stability of character, not just financial resources. A child who's been through trauma needs consistency, patience, and genuine care. Those qualities can't be purchased. The home inspection revealed the ranch house's potential despite its current state of gentle decline. The upstairs bedrooms were spacious and filled with natural light. The kitchen was large enough for family meals, and the surrounding land offered opportunities for outdoor activities that most children never experienced. Janet made notes about necessary repairs, updating the electrical system, fixing the sagging porch, ensuring all windows had proper locks. But her overall assessment seemed positive. Have you thought about what age range you'd be comfortable with? She asked as they concluded the tour. Marcus hadn't considered the question in specific terms. The image in his mind had been vague. A child who needed a home, someone to fill the empty spaces in the ranch house. I honestly don't know. What would you recommend? Teenagers are often the hardest to place, Janet said. Families typically want younger children, thinking they'll be easier to integrate into their lives. But adolescents who age out of the system without finding permanent homes face some of the worst outcomes. They're also old enough to appreciate what you're offering and mature enough to handle ranch life. Thursday brought character references and medical evaluations. Dr. Carver provided both Marcus's medical clearance and a letter of recommendation that painted him as a man of integrity who had demonstrated remarkable resilience during difficult times. Father Miguel Santos from St. Joseph's Catholic Church, where Marcus attended services sporadically but had been married and had buried his wife, wrote about his commitment to community and family values. Tom Bradshaw, despite his standing, offer to buy the ranch, provided a reference that surprised Marcus with its warmth and insight. The elderly rancher described Marcus as someone who understood the true meaning of stewardship, who had maintained his land and treated his animals with respect even when facing financial hardship. "Some men fold under pressure," Tom had written. Marcus Henley gets stronger. Friday morning brought the final approval notification via phone call from Janet Morrison. Marcus had passed all requirements and would be authorized to participate in Saturday's placement event. The news should have felt triumphant, but instead it triggered a wave of anxiety that kept him awake most of Friday night. He spent the pre-dawn hours walking through the ranch house, mentally preparing spaces that might soon house a child whose life had already been marked by instability and loss. Emma called Friday evening, her voice carrying concern across the miles between Montana and Seattle. "Dad, I heard about what you're doing from Dr. Carver. Are you sure about this?" The conversation that followed was both difficult and necessary. Emma worried about her father taking on additional responsibility when he was already struggling. She questioned whether loneliness was driving him to make a decision that might not be in anyone's best interest. But she also acknowledged that the ranch house had always been meant for family, and that her father had always been someone who helped others when help was needed. "If you do this," Emma said finally, "you won't be doing it alone. I can help financially, and I can visit more often. Maybe it's time for me to think about moving back to Montana anyway." Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the pastures and the first serious bite of approaching winter in the air. Marcus dressed carefully in his best jeans, a pressed shirt, and the boots he reserved for church and special occasions. The drive to the Millbrook County Fairgrounds took 25 minutes through countryside, painted in the muted colors of late autumn. The fairgrounds buzzed with activity, unlike anything Marcus had ever witnessed there. Instead of livestock pens and farm equipment displays, the main building had been transformed into something resembling a combination job fair and community center. Tables were arranged throughout the space, each staffed by social workers and volunteers who managed different aspects of the placement process. Approved families received colored badges that identified their status, then moved through a series of stations where they could review profiles of children available for placement. The process was designed to be respectful and thorough, avoiding the auction atmosphere that the name might have suggested. Families could express interest in specific children. Social workers would facilitate meetings, and placements would be made based on mutual compatibility rather than competitive bidding. Marcus's hands shook slightly as he received his yellow badge and moved toward the profile display area. Large poster boards contained photographs and basic information about each child: age, interests, special needs, and brief summaries of their circumstances. The faces that looked back at him represented stories of loss, trauma, and resilience that he could barely comprehend. There were infants who had been surrendered at birth, toddlers removed from unsafe homes, school-age children whose parents had died in accidents or succumbed to illness. There were teenagers who had aged through multiple foster placements, their profiles reading like catalogues of interrupted education and broken trust. Each photograph seemed to ask the same silent question: do you have room in your life for someone like me? Marcus found himself drawn to the teenage section, remembering Janet's words about older children being hardest to place. These were young people on the verge of adulthood, many of whom would be released from state care within a few years, regardless of whether they found permanent homes. Their profiles were often longer, filled with notations about behavioral challenges, educational gaps, and medical needs that had accumulated over years of instability. One profile stopped him completely. The photograph showed a boy who appeared to be around 15, with sandy brown hair and serious grey eyes that seemed older than his years. His name was Daniel Reed, and the brief biography revealed a story that resonated with Marcus in unexpected ways. Daniel had been born to teenage parents who had struggled with addiction. He'd spent his early years moving between relatives before entering foster care at age 7. Multiple placements had failed, not due to behavioral problems, but because of his tendency to withdraw emotionally as a protective mechanism. His interests included reading, outdoor activities, and working with animals. The notes mentioned that he was academically capable, but had fallen behind due to frequent school changes. What struck Marcus most was a comment from Daniel's current caseworker. This young man has tremendous potential, but has learned not to trust that adults will remain in his life. He needs someone willing to demonstrate commitment through consistency rather than words. Marcus stared at the profile for several long minutes, seeing something of himself in those serious grey eyes. Here was someone else who had learned that life could take away everything you thought was permanent. Someone who had built walls to protect himself from further disappointment. Marcus understood that kind of careful distance, the way trust had to be earned slowly through actions rather than promises. At the meeting table, Marcus sat across from Daniel and Janet Morrison, the conversation initially stilted and careful. Daniel answered questions politely, but with obvious wariness, his posture suggesting someone ready to flee at the first sign of disappointment. Marcus found himself talking about the ranch, describing the daily routines of caring for cattle, the seasonal rhythms of agricultural life, the way physical work could provide both purpose and peace. "Do you know anything about ranching?" Marcus asked Daniel directly. "No, sir," Daniel replied, his voice quiet but clear. "I've lived in towns mostly, foster homes in Billings and Great Falls." "Would you be interested in learning?" For the first time, Daniel's expression showed genuine curiosity rather than polite attention. "What would I learn?" Marcus smiled, feeling the first spark of real connection. "Everything. How to care for animals, how to read weather patterns, how to fix machinery that breaks down at the worst possible times, how to be responsible for something bigger than yourself." The conversation that followed revealed Daniel to be more articulate and thoughtful than his profile suggested. He asked intelligent questions about ranch life, about the challenges of agricultural work, about what would be expected of him. Marcus found himself describing not just the work, but the satisfaction that came from building something lasting, from being part of a tradition that connected past and future. Janet observed the interaction with professional attention, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. The placement process required multiple approvals, including Daniel's consent and the recommendation of his caseworker. Nothing would be finalized immediately, but the foundation for a potential match was clearly being established. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said during a quiet moment in the conversation. "Of course. Why do you want to take in someone like me? I mean, I'm not a little kid who's going to think you're some kind of hero. I'll be 18 in 3 years, and then I'll be on my own anyway. Why not choose someone younger who'd be with you longer?" Marcus considered the question carefully, recognizing its importance, not just for Daniel, but for his own understanding of what he was contemplating. "Maybe because you remind me of myself at your age. I thought I had to figure everything out, alone, that asking for help was a sign of weakness. It took me years to learn that the strongest thing you can do is let people care about you." Daniel's expression softened slightly, the protective walls showing their first small crack. "And you think you could care about someone like me?" "I think," Marcus said slowly, "that someone like you might be exactly what someone like me needs." The afternoon included a tour of several potential placements, with Daniel and Marcus spending time together away from the formal interview setting. They walked around the fairgrounds, talking about everything and nothing, discovering shared interests in history and outdoors activities. Daniel asked more questions about ranch life, about the animals, about what a typical day would look like. As the event wound down, Janet Morrison pulled Marcus aside for a final consultation. The placement process would continue through the following week, with home visits and additional interviews before any final decisions were made. But her professional assessment was encouraging. She believed Marcus and Daniel could be a good match, each offering something the other needed. Driving home through the gathering dusk, Marcus felt a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation that he hadn't experienced in years. The ranch house no longer seemed like a monument to loss, but a potential home for new beginnings. The empty rooms upstairs might soon echo with footsteps again, and the kitchen table might host conversations that looked toward the future rather than dwelling on the past. The phone was ringing as he walked through the front door. Emma's voice carried excitement and nervousness in equal measure. "So, how did it go?" Marcus settled into the kitchen chair where he'd filled out paperwork just 3 days earlier, looking out the window toward pastures that might soon be explored by curious teenage feet. "I think," he said slowly, "that your old room might need some updating." Tuesday afternoon brought the phone call that would change both their lives. Janet Morrison's voice carried official formality mixed with genuine warmth as she delivered the news that Marcus had been holding his breath for since Saturday's placement event. "The placement committee has approved the match," she said. "Daniel has also given his consent. If you're still committed to this, we can arrange for him to move to the ranch this weekend." Marcus gripped the phone tighter, suddenly aware that abstract possibility was becoming concrete reality. "This weekend? That's wonderful. What do I need to do to prepare?" The logistics were more complex than he'd anticipated. Daniel would arrive with a social worker on Friday afternoon, bringing the few possessions he'd accumulated during years in the foster system. There would be a transition period with regular check-ins, counseling services available if needed, and educational arrangements to be made with the local high school. Marcus would receive monthly support payments, but more importantly, he would receive guidance on helping Daniel adjust to permanent placement after years of temporary homes. Wednesday and Thursday passed in a blur of preparation that felt simultaneously urgent and surreal. Marcus cleaned Emma's old room thoroughly, replacing faded curtains with new ones from the general store in town. He drove to Billings to purchase a desk, a comfortable reading chair, and bedding that looked more mature than the floral patterns his daughter had favored during high school. The local high school principal, Robert Chen, proved more accommodating than Marcus had expected when he called to discuss Daniel's enrollment. Cedar Valley High School had experience with students from complicated backgrounds, and they had resources for helping academically capable kids catch up on credits they might have missed due to school transfers. "We've had good success with students who come to us from the foster system," Principal Chen explained during their phone conversation. "Often they're more motivated than typical students because they understand what they're working toward. The key is making sure they feel welcomed and supported." Dr. Carver stopped by Thursday evening, ostensibly to check on Marcus's preparations, but really to offer moral support during what she recognized as a significant transition. She brought a casserole that could be frozen for later use and practical advice based on her years of treating adolescents in the community. Teenagers need boundaries, but they also need respect she said, as they sat on the front porch in the gathering dusk. Daniel's been through enough situations where adults held all the power and he had none. He'll need to learn that you're different, that you see him as a person rather than a problem to be managed. Friday morning arrived grey and blustery, with clouds building over the mountains that suggested the season's first serious snowfall might not be far away. Marcus found himself checking the clock repeatedly, adjusting and readjusting preparations that were already complete. He'd stocked the refrigerator with foods that seemed appropriate for a teenage appetite, organized the barn to show Daniel the daily routines he'd soon be learning, and mentally rehearsed conversations that would probably unfold nothing like he imagined. The sound of tires on gravel announced their arrival at exactly 3 o'clock. Through the kitchen window, Marcus watched a state vehicle park near the front porch, followed by Janet Morrison emerging from the driver's seat. The passenger door opened more slowly, revealing Daniel, carrying a single duffel bag and looking around the ranch with an expression that mixed curiosity with careful reservation. Marcus met them on the front porch, suddenly aware of how the ranch must appear to someone seeing it for the first time. The sagging boards, the peeling paint, the general air of a place where maintenance had been deferred, all of it seemed more pronounced under scrutiny. But Daniel's attention seemed focused less on the house's shortcomings and more on the vast expanse of pasture stretching toward the mountains, the cattle grazing in the distance, the sense of space and quietude that urban living never provided. "It's bigger than I imagined," Daniel said, his first words carrying genuine surprise. 800 acres, Marcus replied. "Most of it is grazing land, but there's timber up on the ridge and a creek that runs year-round through the eastern section." Janet Morrison conducted a brief walkthrough, checking that the room preparations met state requirements and reviewing the support services that would be available during Daniel's transition period. She spoke with both Marcus and Daniel separately, ensuring that everyone understood the commitment they were making and the resources available if challenges arose. "I'll be back next Friday for the first check-in," she told Marcus as she prepared to leave. "Call me immediately if any problems come up, but honestly, I think this is going to work out well for both of you." After Janet's departure, Marcus and Daniel stood in the kitchen facing each other with the awkwardness of strangers who had suddenly become family. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, filled with unspoken questions and unstated expectations. "Would you like to see the rest of the ranch?" Marcus asked finally. "Get a sense of what we do here." The tour that followed revealed Daniel to be observant and genuinely interested in the mechanics of ranch operation. He asked thoughtful questions about the cattle, about seasonal routines, about the equipment stored in various outbuildings. When they reached the barn, Marcus introduced him to the horses, 3 aging mares who had been companions more than working animals in recent years. "Can you ride?" Marcus asked, watching Daniel approach the horses with appropriate caution. "No, sir, never had the opportunity. We'll fix that. Can't live on a ranch without knowing how to handle horses." Daniel's smile was the first completely unguarded expression Marcus had seen from him. "I'd like that." The evening meal was simple. Grilled steaks from cattle Marcus had raised himself, potatoes from the garden Sarah had planted years earlier, and conversation that gradually became less stilted as they discovered shared interests in history and current events. Daniel proved to be well-read despite his educational disruptions, with opinions on topics ranging from local politics to national issues that showed both intelligence and maturity. The other kids in foster care, they mostly just wanted to survive. "Until they aged out," Daniel said during a quiet moment in the conversation. "But I always figured I wanted to learn something useful, develop skills that would matter when I was on my own." "You won't be on your own," Marcus said quietly. "Not as long as you don't want to be." Daniel looked at him carefully, as if evaluating the sincerity behind the words. People say things like that. But situations change, circumstances change. I learned not to count on promises about the future. The honesty was both painful and necessary. Marcus recognized that Daniel's wariness came from experience, not pessimism. Trust would have to be earned through consistency rather than declared through good intentions. Saturday morning brought Daniel's first real introduction to ranch work. Marcus woke him at dawn, not as punishment, but as invitation into the rhythm that had governed his life for decades. The cattle needed hay, water tanks needed checking, and fence lines required constant maintenance. The work was physical but not overwhelming, requiring attention and care rather than strength. Daniel approached each task with methodical determination, listening carefully to instructions and asking questions when something wasn't clear. He showed no hesitation about getting dirty, no complaint about the early hour or the cold air that made their breath visible in white puffs. When Marcus demonstrated how to properly distribute hay to ensure every animal got adequate nutrition, Daniel absorbed the lesson with the focus of someone who understood that knowledge had practical value. "The cattle know when feeding time comes," Marcus explained as they walked among the herd. "They'll start gathering near the gate about 20 minutes before we usually arrive. Animals have better internal clocks than most people." "How do you know which ones might be sick or injured?" Daniel asked, watching the cattle with new attention. "You learn to read their behavior. A cow that stands apart from the herd, that doesn't come to feed eagerly, that moves differently than usual, those are signs something might be wrong." Ranching is really about observation and attention to detail. The lesson extended beyond cattle, care into the broader philosophy that Marcus had learned from his grandfather decades earlier. Successful ranching required understanding that humans were stewards rather than masters, responsible for the well-being of animals and land that had been entrusted to their care. It demanded patience, consistency, and the ability to think beyond immediate needs to long-term sustainability. Sunday brought their first real test. Daniel woke before dawn with obvious stomach distress, his face pale and drawn. Marcus found him in the bathroom, clearly miserable, but trying to hide his condition out of what seemed like fear that illness might be seen as weakness or inconvenience. "I'm sorry," Daniel said when Marcus knocked on the bathroom door. "I know. There's work to do. I'll be fine in a few minutes." "The work will wait," Marcus replied firmly. "Your health comes first." Dr. Carver's house call revealed nothing more serious than a mild stomach bug, probably stress-related given the major life transition Daniel was experiencing. But her presence gave Marcus the opportunity to demonstrate that promises about prioritizing Daniel's well-being weren't empty words. He cancelled his plans for fence repair, prepared bland foods that would be easy on Daniel's stomach, and spent the day reading quietly in the living room so Daniel wouldn't feel isolated while he recovered. The incident marked a subtle shift in their relationship. Daniel's defensive wariness began to crack slightly, replaced by cautious hope that this placement might be different from previous experiences. Marcus, for his part, discovered that caring for someone else's immediate needs provided a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since Sarah's death. Monday morning brought Daniel's first day at Cedar Valley High School. The building was smaller than the urban schools he'd attended previously, with less than 300 students total and a more personal atmosphere where everyone knew everyone else's family history. Principal Chen personally introduced Daniel to his teachers, explaining his background in general terms that emphasized his potential rather than his challenges. Marcus drove him to school that first morning, planning to pick him up afterward, but Daniel surprised him by expressing interest in taking the school bus both ways. "I want to try to fit in as normally as possible," he explained. "Being driven by a parent figure might make me seem different from other kids." The insight impressed Marcus with its maturity and social awareness. Daniel understood that successful integration would require navigating not just academic challenges, but social dynamics that could be complicated by his unusual circumstances. The first week established routines that would define their life together. Early mornings with ranch work before school, afternoons devoted to homework and additional outdoor tasks, evenings spent in conversation or companionable silence as they each pursued individual interests. Daniel proved to be mechanically inclined, showing genuine enthusiasm for learning to maintain and repair the various pieces of equipment that kept the ranch operational. My dad in Billings, my foster dad, he never let me touch anything mechanical, Daniel said one evening as Marcus taught him to change the oil in the ranch truck. Said kids just broke things and made more work for adults. Different philosophy here, Marcus replied, guiding Daniel's hands to show him how to properly tighten the drain plug. You can't learn without doing, and you can't become responsible without being given responsibility. The statement seemed to resonate with Daniel in ways that extended beyond mechanical skills. Over the following days, Marcus noticed him taking initiative in small ways, checking water levels in the cattle tanks without being asked, organizing tools in the barn, taking responsibility for keeping his room and personal belongings orderly. 2 weeks after Daniel's arrival, Marcus received a call from Tom Bradshaw, the neighboring rancher who had previously offered to buy the Henley property. Tom's tone was carefully neutral as he asked about the new addition to Marcus's household. Heard through the grapevine that you took in one of those foster kids from the placement event, Tom said. How's that working out? Better than I expected, Marcus replied honestly. Daniel's a good kid who's had some bad breaks. He's fitting in well. That's good to hear. I'll be honest with you, Marcus. When I heard what you were doing, I wondered if you might be taking on more than you could handle, given everything else you're dealing with. But if it's working out, I'm glad for both of you. The conversation reminded Marcus that their new family arrangement was being observed and evaluated by the broader community. Cedar Valley was small enough that everyone's business became general knowledge eventually, and Daniel's successful integration would depend partly on how well he was accepted by neighbors, teachers, and peers who had their own opinions about foster children and unconventional families. But as Marcus watched Daniel working in the barn that evening, teaching one of the older mares to accept a lead rope with patience and gentle persistence, he felt confident that the community would see what he was beginning to understand. Daniel wasn't a charity case or a social experiment. He was a young man with tremendous potential who had finally found a place where that potential could flourish. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Daniel's posture had straightened, his voice had grown stronger, and his eyes no longer held the wariness of someone expecting disappointment. He was beginning to believe that this placement might be permanent, that the ranch might truly become his home, and that Marcus's commitment might prove to be as solid as the Montana mountains that surrounded their valley. 3 weeks into November brought the season's first serious snowfall, transforming the ranch into a landscape that Daniel had never experienced. He stood at his bedroom window before dawn, mesmerized by the way moonlight reflected off snow-covered pastures, creating a silver world that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the mountains. Downstairs, Marcus was already preparing for the additional challenges that winter weather brought to ranch operations. Water lines needed protection from freezing, cattle required sheltered feeding areas, and equipment had to be winterized for months of sub-zero temperatures. Daniel appeared in the kitchen earlier than usual, dressed in layers and ready for whatever the day demanded. First, real snow, Marcus observed, handing Daniel a cup of coffee that had become part of their morning routine. Changes everything about how we work. The education that followed was comprehensive and practical. Daniel learned to break ice on water tanks, to distribute hay in ways that provided windbreaks for cattle, and to recognize signs of hypothermia or frostbite in animals that might struggle with sudden temperature drops. The work was harder than summer routines, but Daniel approached it with the same methodical determination that had impressed Marcus from the beginning. In the old days, winters like this could kill entire herds, Marcus explained, as they checked fence lines for damage caused by wind-driven snow. Modern ranching has better equipment and knowledge, but respect for the weather is still the difference between success and disaster. Daniel absorbed these lessons with the intensity of someone who understood that knowledge had survival value. But more than that, Marcus began to notice Daniel was developing genuine affection for the animals under their care. He'd started naming individual cattle, recognizing their personalities and preferences, showing the kind of personal investment that couldn't be taught. The first crisis came on a Tuesday evening when Daniel failed to return from school at his usual time. The bus driver confirmed that Daniel had been dropped off at the ranch gate as always, but by 6 o'clock, with darkness falling and temperatures dropping into the teens, there was still no sign of him. Marcus's initial reaction was controlled panic. His mind raced through possibilities: injury, accident, or worse, the possibility that Daniel had decided ranch life wasn't for him and had simply left. The foster system had warned about attachment difficulties, about children who sabotaged relationships when they began to feel too secure, as if testing whether promises of permanence were genuine. The search began methodically. Marcus checked the barn, the equipment sheds, and the house thoroughly before expanding to the pastures and creek areas where Daniel might have gone to think or explore. He called Daniel's name repeatedly, his voice echoing across snow-covered fields that seemed vast and dangerous in the growing darkness. At 7:30, Marcus was preparing to call the sheriff when he heard faint sounds coming from the direction of the old grain silo that hadn't been used in years. Inside, he found Daniel huddled with one of the ranch cats, a half-wild tabby that had never shown interest in human contact before. She was caught in the barbed wire fence down by the creek, Daniel explained, his voice thick with emotion. Her leg was bleeding and she was scared. I couldn't just leave her. The story that emerged revealed Daniel's growing connection to the ranch in ways that went beyond assigned responsibilities. He'd been exploring the property after school, learning its boundaries and hidden corners when he discovered the injured cat. Rather than coming to the house for help, he'd spent hours gaining the animal's trust, carefully freeing her from the wire and bringing her to shelter. I know I should have come to get you, Daniel said, as Marcus examined the cat's injured leg by flashlight. But I was afraid she'd run away if I left, and I was afraid she might die if I waited too long. Dr. Carver made a house call despite the late hour, treating the cat's wounds and pronouncing the injury painful but not serious. But more importantly, she observed the interaction between Marcus and Daniel during the crisis, noting how naturally they had worked together to address the emergency. Most teenagers would have either ignored an injured animal or handled the situation less thoughtfully, she told Marcus privately, as they watched Daniel create a comfortable recovery area for the cat in the barn. This shows real character development, real investment in this place as his home. The incident marked another shift in their relationship. Marcus realized that Daniel's dedication to ranch life was becoming emotional as well as practical, that he was developing the kind of personal connection to the land and animals that couldn't be forced or taught. Daniel, for his part, seemed to understand that Marcus's concern during his absence came from genuine care rather than mere obligation. December brought new challenges and unexpected opportunities. Daniel's grades at Cedar Valley High School were excellent, despite his disrupted educational background, earning him recognition from teachers who praised his work ethic and maturity. More significantly, he'd begun forming friendships with classmates who accepted him without curiosity about his foster care history. "There's a Christmas dance at school," Daniel mentioned one evening, as they worked on winter equipment maintenance. In the barn. I was thinking I might ask Sarah Chen to go with me. The casual mention of normal teenage social activities pleased Marcus more than academic achievements or work accomplishments. It suggested that Daniel was building a life that extended beyond the ranch, creating connections that would anchor him in the community regardless of what the future held. Sarah Chen is Principal Chen's daughter? Marcus asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Yeah, she's in my history class, really smart, and she doesn't make a big deal about me being different. The conversation that followed covered practical matters. Transportation to the dance, appropriate clothing, and basic social expectations. But underneath the logistics, Marcus recognized a milestone. Daniel was planning for social events, thinking about relationships, investing in a future that assumed stability and belonging. The Christmas dance became a community affair that revealed how thoroughly Daniel had been accepted by his peers and their families. Principal Chen personally thanked Marcus for the positive influence Daniel had brought to their school, noting improvements in class discussions and study groups that seemed to stem from Daniel's serious approach to education. He's become a leader without trying to be, Principal Chen observed. Other students respect his opinions and follow his example when it comes to academic work. That's unusual for someone who's been here such a short time. Christmas preparation brought Daniel face to face with family traditions he'd never experienced. The ranch had always celebrated modestly, but Sarah had established customs that Marcus had continued even during his years of solitude. Now, with Daniel present, those traditions took on new meaning and required explanation. We cut our own tree from the back section of the property, Marcus explained, as they trudged through snow-covered forest, looking for the right specimen. Sarah always said store-bought trees didn't have the same soul as ones that grew on land you cared for. Daniel's enthusiasm for the tradition was infectious. He approached tree selection with the same methodical care he brought to ranch work, evaluating options based on shape, size, and the way they would fit in the living room corner that had hosted Christmas trees for decades. His excitement about decorating, about preparing special meals, about the entire ritual of Christmas celebration reminded Marcus how much joy had been absent from the ranch during his years of grief. Emma's Christmas visit created the first real test of their new family dynamic. She arrived on December 22nd, curious about the changes in her father and eager to meet the young man who had brought life back to the ranch house. The initial interactions were cautious on both sides. Emma, protective of her father's well-being, Daniel uncertain about his place in family dynamics that predated his arrival. But Emma's nursing background gave her insight into trauma and recovery that proved valuable in understanding Daniel's journey. She recognized signs of healing in his demeanor, noted the way he'd gained weight and confidence since arriving at the ranch, and appreciated the sense of purpose that caring for Daniel had restored to her father's life. You're good for each. She told Marcus privately on Christmas Eve as they watched Daniel teaching one of the horses to accept a new bridle. Dad, you look healthier than you have since Mom died, and Daniel, he's becoming the person he was meant to be. Christmas morning brought gifts that reflected their growing understanding of each other's interests and needs. Marcus gave Daniel a leather-bound journal for recording ranch observations and a professional quality set of tools for mechanical work. Daniel's gift to Marcus was more personal. A photograph he'd taken of the ranch at sunrise, professionally framed with an inscription that read, "Home isn't a place, it's where people care about you." The emotional impact of the inscription surprised Marcus with its intensity. After years of thinking of the ranch primarily as a burden to be maintained, Daniel's words reframed it as something precious to be shared. The photograph itself revealed artistic talent that Daniel had never mentioned, suggesting depths and interests that were still being discovered. "When did you take this?" Marcus asked, studying the image that captured the ranch buildings against a backdrop of mountains painted gold by early morning light. "About 2 weeks ago," Daniel replied. "I've been getting up early sometimes, just to watch the sunrise over the valley. The light changes so fast here, and I wanted to capture how beautiful it really is." January brought the deepest cold of the winter and the most serious test of Daniel's commitment to ranch life. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero for a week straight, creating conditions that made every outdoor task dangerous and difficult. Water systems froze despite precautions, equipment failed in ways that required creative solutions, and cattle needed constant attention to prevent hypothermia. Daniel never complained about the brutal conditions or suggested that indoor activities might be preferable. Instead, he approached each challenge as a problem to be solved, often suggesting solutions that Marcus hadn't considered. His mechanical aptitude proved invaluable when the barn heater failed and parts weren't available. Until the following week, we could rig a temporary heating system using the portable propane heaters from the equipment shed, Daniel suggested after they'd spent an hour trying to restart the main unit. "It won't be perfect, but it would keep the water from freezing until we can get the right parts." The improvised solution worked well enough to get them through the cold snap, but more importantly, it demonstrated Daniel's growing confidence in taking initiative and solving problems independently. Marcus began to see qualities that reminded him of his grandfather: the ability to remain calm under pressure, to find practical solutions to immediate problems, and to take personal responsibility for the well-being of animals and land under his care. February brought the first serious discussion about Daniel's long-term future. Janet Morrison's monthly visits had become routine check-ins that consistently reported positive progress, but the legal aspects of Daniel's placement would require decisions about permanent guardianship or adoption before his 18th birthday. "Have you thought about what you want to do after high school?" Marcus asked one evening as they reviewed Daniel's academic progress and college preparatory options. "I want to study agricultural science," Daniel replied without hesitation. "Montana State has a good program, and I could come back here to help run the ranch, if that's something you'd want." The conversation that followed covered practical matters: college applications, financial aid, and the logistics of maintaining ranch operations while Daniel pursued higher education. But underneath the practical considerations, both of them understood they were discussing a future that assumed permanent family bonds and shared responsibility for the ranch's continued operation. "This place needs someone who understands it, who cares about it the way it deserves," Marcus said finally. "I can't think of anyone I'd rather pass it on to." Daniel's smile was radiant, transforming his entire appearance in ways that reminded Marcus how much the young man had changed since that first meeting at the placement event. The guarded wariness had been replaced by confidence and genuine happiness, the careful emotional distance replaced by open affection and commitment. March brought the first signs of spring and preparation for Daniel's first calving season on the ranch. New life arriving after the harsh winter would test everything he'd learned about animal care and ranch management. But Marcus felt confident that Daniel was ready for the responsibility. Standing on the front porch one evening, watching Daniel work with the horses in the pasture below, Marcus reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past 6 months. The ranch that had seemed like a burden threatening to destroy his future had become a gift to be shared with someone who appreciated its value. Daniel, who had arrived expecting another temporary placement, had found a permanent home and a future that stretched as far as the Montana horizon. The sound of Daniel's laughter carried across the evening air as one of the horses nuzzled his shoulder, seeking the apple treats that had become part of their daily routine. It was a sound that had been absent from the ranch for far too long, and Marcus silently thanked whatever forces had brought them together at exactly the moment when they both needed what the other could provide. April's arrival brought the kind of crisis that tests everything a rancher believes about preparation and perseverance. The spring thaw had been proceeding normally when an unexpected late-season blizzard struck the valley with devastating force. 3 feet of heavy, wet snow fell in 18 hours, followed by temperatures that plummeted back into the single digits. Daniel woke to Marcus, shaking his shoulder at 4 in the morning, his face grim in the lamplight. "We've got trouble. Cattle are trapped in the lower pasture, and I can hear them bawling from here. Some of the pregnant cows were due this week." The next 12 hours became a masterclass in emergency ranch management that pushed both of them beyond anything they'd experienced together. The snow was too deep for the truck, too soft for the horses, and too dangerous for the cattle to navigate on their own. Marcus made the decision to attempt a rescue operation using the old snowmobile that had been gathering dust in the equipment shed. "This is going to be dangerous," Marcus warned, as they loaded the snowmobile with hay, medical supplies, and emergency equipment. "If something goes wrong out there, we could both be in serious trouble." Daniel's response was immediate and unwavering. "Then we make sure nothing goes wrong." The trek to the lower pasture revealed the full scope of the disaster. 43 head of cattle were trapped in a natural depression where the snow had drifted even deeper, creating walls that prevented escape. Several animals showed signs of hypothermia, and Marcus could see at least 3 cows displaying the restless behavior that indicated imminent calving. The rescue operation required splitting up despite the risks. Marcus focused on the cattle, showing signs of immediate distress, while Daniel worked to create pathways through the snowdrifts that would allow the healthier animals to reach higher ground. The work was exhausting and dangerous, with both of them frequently sinking waist-deep in snow that concealed hazards like hidden rocks and fence posts. "Marcus!" Daniel's shout carried panic that cut through the wind. "One of the cows is down, and I think she's calving." The scene that greeted Marcus was both heartbreaking and miraculous. A young heifer struggling with her first calf had collapsed in the snow and was clearly in distress. The calf was partially born but appeared to be stuck, and both mother and baby were at risk of dying from exposure if they couldn't complete the birth quickly. What followed was an impromptu veterinary emergency in conditions that would have challenged experienced professionals. Marcus guided Daniel through the process of assisting the birth, explaining each step while working to keep both animals warm and stable. Daniel's hands, steadier than his own in the cold, followed instructions precisely, showing no hesitation. Despite the life or death stakes, when the calf finally emerged, alive and breathing, both Marcus and Daniel sat back in the snow, exhausted but triumphant. The mother cow, revived by the successful birth, struggled to her feet and began cleaning her newborn with the determined intensity that spoke to the miracle of life continuing despite impossible circumstances. "We did it," Daniel said, his voice filled with wonder as he watched the calf attempt its first steps. "We actually saved them." The rescue operation continued for 6 more hours, with both of them working beyond exhaustion to move the entire herd to safety. By the time the last animal reached the upper pasture, both Marcus and Daniel were hypothermic themselves, their clothes soaked through and their movements slowed by cold that had penetrated to their bones. Dr. Carver's house call that evening revealed the full scope of what they'd accomplished. All 43 cattle had survived, including 3 calves born during the emergency. Both Marcus and Daniel were treated for mild hypothermia and exhaustion, but their quick thinking and coordinated effort had prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss. "In 30 years of treating ranchers, I've rarely seen anything like what you two pulled off today," Dr. Carver told them as she finished her examination. You saved not just those animals, but probably the entire future of this ranch. The community response to news of their emergency rescue was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors arrived with hot food, offers of help with daily chores, and expressions of admiration for what many recognized as heroic effort under impossible conditions. Tom Bradshaw, the neighboring rancher, spent an hour examining the rescued cattle and pronounced the operation the kind of ranching that built this valley. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the rescue, a truck pulled into the ranch driveway carrying Jim Morrison, a cattle buyer from Billings, who had heard about the emergency through the regional ranching network. "Word is, you two saved an entire herd in that blizzard," Morrison said, his tone carrying the respect of one professional acknowledging another. That kind of dedication and skill doesn't go unnoticed in this business. The conversation that followed changed everything about the ranch's financial prospects. Morrison explained that he represented a consortium of buyers who were always looking for cattle raised by ranchers who demonstrated exceptional animal husbandry. The rescue operation had proved that Marcus and Daniel were exactly the kind of operators they wanted to work with. "We're prepared to offer premium prices for your cattle, plus a long-term contract that would guarantee purchase of your entire annual production," Morrison explained. "The market values ranchers who treat their animals with the kind of care you demonstrated last week." The financial details were staggering. The premium prices would not only cover the ranch's current debts, but provide operating capital for expansion and improvement. More importantly, the long-term contract offered the financial security that had been missing from Marcus's life since Sarah's illness. Daniel listened to the negotiations with growing excitement, but also with questions that revealed his deepening understanding of ranch economics. "What about sustainability?" he asked Morrison. "Are you looking for quantity or quality? Because this ranch has always been about raising cattle the right way, not just raising as many as possible." Morrison's smile suggested that Daniel's question had impressed him. "Quality, son, always quality. Ranchers who care about doing things right are the ones who produce the cattle that command premium prices." The contract signing took place the following week, witnessed by Janet Morrison, who noted that the financial stability it provided would eliminate any concerns about Daniel's placement. The monthly state support payments, while helpful, paled in comparison to the economic security that the cattle contract represented. "This changes everything," Marcus told Daniel as they reviewed the contract terms. "We can make improvements to the ranch, upgrade equipment, maybe even expand the operation if you're interested in taking on more responsibility." Daniel's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "I want to learn everything, not just the daily operations, but the business side, the financial planning, the long-term strategy. I want to understand how to make this ranch successful for the next generation." May brought the first implementations of their expansion plans. New fencing, improved water systems, and updated equipment transformed the ranch's operational efficiency while providing Daniel with hands-on education in agricultural technology and business management. He approached each new system with the same methodical attention he'd brought to basic ranch chores, but now with the confidence of someone who understood his role in the operation's success. The most significant change was the addition of breeding stock that would improve the ranch's genetic diversity and increase production capacity. Daniel took primary responsibility for the new animals, applying lessons learned during the blizzard rescue to establish protocols for monitoring, feeding, and healthcare that exceeded industry standards. "You've got an eye for cattle that can't be taught," Tom Bradshaw observed during one of his visits to see the improvements. "Some people learn the technical aspects, but never develop the instinct for reading animals and understanding what they need. You've got both." June brought Daniel's final exams and the completion of his junior year at Cedar Valley High School. His academic performance had remained excellent despite the additional responsibilities he'd taken on at the ranch, earning him recognition as one of the top students in his class and attracting attention from college recruiters. Montana State's agricultural program is very interested in Daniel, Principal Chen told Marcus during a conference about Daniel's college preparations. His combination of practical experience and academic achievement is exactly what they're looking for in their scholarship candidates. The scholarship opportunity opened possibilities that neither Marcus nor Daniel had previously considered. Full tuition, plus stipends for books and living expenses, would allow Daniel to pursue his degree without creating financial hardship for the ranch operation. Even better, the program included internship opportunities that would allow him to gain additional experience while continuing his education. "I want to accept the scholarship," Daniel told Marcus as they discussed the opportunity, "but I want to structure my studies so I can come back here every summer and holiday break. This ranch is my home, and I want to be part of its future." The conversation that followed was both practical and emotional. Marcus had never imagined that the ranch would continue beyond his own lifetime, but Daniel's commitment and capability offered the possibility of multi-generational continuity that honored the dreams of Marcus's grandfather. The scholarship would provide Daniel with knowledge and credentials that would benefit the ranch's long-term development, while ensuring that he remained connected to the land and animals that had become central to his identity. July brought the formal adoption proceedings that would make Daniel's place in the family legally permanent. The paperwork was complex, but Janet Morrison guided them through the process with the efficiency of someone who had facilitated many such transitions. The legal formalities seemed almost anticlimactic, given the emotional bonds that had already been established, but they provided official recognition of what had become undeniably true. "This is really just confirming what already exists," Janet told them as they signed the final documents. "You two became family months ago. The law is just catching up with reality." The adoption celebration was a community affair that filled the ranch house with neighbors, friends, and school faculty who had watched Daniel's transformation from cautious foster child to confident young man with deep roots in Cedar Valley. Emma drove from Seattle to attend, bringing photo albums and family mementos that helped Daniel understand his place in the Henley family history. "Welcome to the family officially," Emma said, as she presented Daniel with a leather-bound album containing 4 generations of ranch photographs. "These are your stories now, and someday you'll be adding your own chapters." August brought Daniel's first experience with the autumn cattle roundup, a traditional event that brought together ranchers from throughout the valley to move herds from summer pastures to winter feeding areas. The roundup required skills in horsemanship, cattle handling, and coordination that Daniel had been developing throughout his time on the ranch. Marcus watched with pride as Daniel demonstrated competence and confidence that impressed experienced ranchers who had initially been skeptical about his abilities. The young man who had arrived at the ranch with no knowledge of agricultural life now moved among cattle and horses with natural grace, earning respect from neighbors who valued practical skill above all other qualifications. "That boy of yours has turned into quite a rancher," Tom Bradshaw observed as they watched Daniel work with a group of particularly stubborn cattle. "He's got the hands for it, but more importantly, he's got the heart for it." The roundup also provided Daniel with his first opportunity to demonstrate leadership skills among his peers. Several other ranchers had brought their teenage children to participate, and Daniel naturally assumed a teaching role, sharing techniques and knowledge he'd acquired through intensive experience and study. "He's becoming the kind of person who others look to for guidance," Marcus realized as he watched Daniel help a younger boy learn to properly use a lasso. That's a rare quality, especially in someone his age. September brought the beginning of Daniel's senior year and the start of college application processes that would determine his immediate future after graduation. The scholarship to Montana State remained his first choice, but other opportunities had emerged as word spread about his academic achievements and practical experience. "I've been thinking about our conversation about the ranch's future," Daniel said one evening as they worked on equipment maintenance. "I want to major in agricultural business as well as animal science. If I'm going to help run this operation, I need to understand both the technical and financial aspects." The dual major would require additional coursework and extend his time in college, but Marcus enthusiastically supported the decision. The ranch's recent financial success had proved that modern agricultural operations required sophisticated business skills as well as traditional ranching knowledge. October brought the first anniversary of Daniel's placement at the ranch, a milestone that prompted reflection on the remarkable transformation that had occurred in both their lives. The struggling rancher, who had attended the placement event out of loneliness and desperation, had become a successful businessman and devoted father. The guarded teenager who had expected another temporary placement had become a confident young man with clear direction and deep family roots. Standing on the front porch where he'd first welcomed Daniel a year earlier, Marcus marveled at how completely their lives had changed. The ranch that had once seemed like a burden threatening to crush him had become a thriving operation with a secure future. The empty house that had echoed with loneliness now filled with conversation, laughter, and the comfortable sounds of family life. "Did you ever imagine it would work out like this?" Daniel asked, joining Marcus on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains. "Never," Marcus replied honestly. "I thought I was just helping a kid who needed a home. I had no idea I was saving my own life in the process." Daniel's smile was radiant with the confidence and happiness that had replaced the careful wariness of a year earlier. "Turns out we were both exactly what the other one needed." November of Daniel's senior year brought news that would test everything their newly formed family had built together. The phone call came on a grey Tuesday morning while Daniel was at school and Marcus was working on winterizing equipment in the barn. "Mr. Henley, this is Detective Sarah Walsh with the Montana State Police." The voice on the other end was professional, but carried an undertone of concern. "I need to speak with you about Daniel Reed. There's been a development in his case that requires immediate attention." Marcus felt his stomach drop. In the 18 months since Daniel's placement, they'd heard nothing from his biological family or previous placements. The adoption had been finalized without complications, suggesting that Daniel's past was truly behind them. Now, apparently, something had changed. Detective Walsh explained that Daniel's biological father, whom Daniel had never mentioned and who had been absent from his life since early childhood, had been released from a 15-year prison sentence for armed robbery. Upon his release, he'd begun making inquiries about his son's whereabouts, claiming parental rights that complicated Daniel's legal status despite the completed adoption. "The adoption should protect Daniel's placement with your family," Detective Walsh explained, "but his biological father is working with a legal aid attorney who's claiming the original termination of parental rights was improperly handled. They're requesting a review of Daniel's case." The legal complexities were staggering. Daniel's biological father, whose name was Vincent Reed, had signed away his parental rights when Daniel was 7 years old, allowing the boy to enter foster care permanently. However, Vincent's attorney was arguing that he'd been coerced into the decision and hadn't understood the permanent nature of the termination. "What does this mean for Daniel?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Probably nothing," Detective Walsh assured him. "The adoption is legally solid, and courts rarely reverse permanent placements when children are thriving in stable homes. But Vincent Reed has requested visitation rights, and the court may be required to consider his petition. Marcus spent the rest of the morning grappling with how to tell Daniel about this development. The young man had never spoken about his biological father, and Marcus had assumed that chapter of Daniel's life was permanently closed. Now suddenly, a man who had been absent for Daniel's entire remembered life was claiming the right to disrupt the stability they'd worked so hard to build. When Daniel returned from school that afternoon, Marcus was waiting in the kitchen with the gravity of the situation written clearly on his face. Daniel's expression immediately shifted to concern as he recognized the signs of serious trouble. "What's wrong?" Daniel asked, dropping his backpack and taking a seat at the kitchen table where they'd shared so many important conversations. Marcus explained the situation carefully, watching Daniel's face for reactions that might guide his response. Initially, Daniel showed only confusion. The name Vincent Reed seemed to mean nothing to him, but as the full implications became clear, confusion gave way to anger, then to fear, and finally to something that looked like betrayal. "He left," Daniel said finally, his voice quiet but intense. "He signed papers saying he didn't want anything to do with me, and now, after all these years, he thinks he can just show up and claim to be my father. The law requires that we take his petition." "Seriously?" Marcus explained, "but it doesn't mean anything will change. You're my son now, legally and in every other way that matters. This is your home, and no one can change that." But Daniel's reaction was more complex than simple reassurance could address. The teenager who had learned to trust in permanent family bonds was suddenly confronted with the possibility that permanence was an illusion, that the past could reach forward to threaten the future he'd built. "What if the court decides he has rights?" Daniel asked. "What if they make me have contact with him?" "Then we'll deal with it together," Marcus replied firmly. "Whatever happens, you're not facing this alone." The next week brought a visit from Janet Morrison, who explained the legal process they would likely face. Vincent Reed's petition would require a court hearing where his claims of improper termination would be evaluated. Daniel, as the subject of the petition, would have the right to express his preferences, and his current stable placement would be strongly considered. "Courts prioritize the best interests of the child," Janet explained during their kitchen table conference. "Daniel is 17, academically successful, and clearly thriving in his current placement. It would be extremely unusual for a court to disrupt that stability to accommodate the wishes of an absent biological parent." Despite these reassurances, the uncertainty created stress that affected every aspect of their daily routine. Daniel's grades remained strong, but his teachers noticed increased anxiety and distraction. His sleep was disrupted by nightmares about being forced to leave the ranch, and his appetite decreased as worry consumed his attention. Marcus struggled with his own fears while trying to provide stability for Daniel. The possibility of losing the young man who had become the center of his world was terrifying. But even more distressing was watching Daniel retreat emotionally as old protective mechanisms reasserted themselves. "He's scared," Dr. Carver observed, during a house call that was really a wellness check on both of them. "All of his abandonment issues are being triggered by this threat to his security. He needs constant reassurance that you're not going anywhere, regardless of what happens with the legal situation." The court hearing was scheduled for the first week of December, creating a timeline that would disrupt Daniel's final semester of high school and his college application processes. The scholarship to Montana State required final paperwork by mid-December, and the uncertainty about his legal status threatened to complicate everything they'd planned for his future. 2 weeks before the hearing, Vincent Reed requested a meeting with Daniel. The petition filed through his attorney claimed that he wanted to reconnect with his son and make amends for past mistakes. The court appointed a guardian ad litem to represent Daniel's interests and recommend whether such a meeting would be beneficial. "I don't want to see him," Daniel told the guardian ad litem, a family law attorney named Rebecca Torres, who specialized in cases involving older children in foster care. "He's not my father in any way that matters. Marcus is my father." But Vincent, Reed's attorney, argued that Daniel's refusal to meet was evidence of parental alienation, orchestrated by Marcus and the foster care system. The legal maneuvering created additional stress and forced Daniel to articulate feelings about family, belonging, and identity that he'd never had to defend before. The week before the hearing brought an unexpected development that changed everything about the case. Detective Walsh called with news that Vincent Reed had been arrested for violating his parole conditions by leaving the state without permission and failing to report to his parole officer. He apparently drove to Colorado to visit another relative. Detective Walsh explained, when he failed to check in as required, a warrant was issued for his arrest. This significantly weakens his petition for visitation rights. The arrest didn't automatically end the legal proceedings, but it provided additional evidence that Vincent Reed lacked the stability and responsibility required for meaningful involvement in Daniel's life. More importantly, it demonstrated that his claims about wanting to be a responsible parent were inconsistent with his actual behavior. The court hearing, when it finally occurred, lasted less than 2 hours. Vincent Reed, appearing via video link from the county jail, where he was being held on the parole violation, made an emotional plea for the chance to know his son. His attorney argued that past mistakes shouldn't permanently disqualify him from attempting to build a relationship with Daniel, but the evidence presented by Daniel's legal team was overwhelming. School records, medical records, and testimonials from community members painted a picture of a young man who had found stability and success in his current placement. Daniel's own testimony, delivered with calm confidence, left no doubt about his feelings regarding his future. "Vincent Reed is my biological father, but he's never been a parent to me in any meaningful sense," Daniel told the court. "Marcus Henley saved my life, gave me a home, and showed me what family really means. The Henley Ranch is where I belong, and that's where I want to stay." The judge's decision was unambiguous. Vincent Reed's petition was denied, his parental rights confirmed as properly terminated, and Daniel's adoption by Marcus affirmed as permanent and unchangeable. The judge also issued a restraining order preventing Vincent Reed from contacting Daniel directly or attempting to visit the ranch. This court finds that Daniel Reed, now Daniel Henley, is thriving in his current placement, and that any disruption to his family stability would be contrary to his best interests, the judge stated. The adoption is final and will not be subject to further review. The drive home from the courthouse was quiet, both Marcus and Daniel processing the relief of having their worst fears officially dismissed. But the experience had revealed vulnerabilities in their relationship that needed addressing, and it had forced both of them to articulate feelings that had previously remained unspoken. "I was terrified," Daniel admitted, as they pulled into the ranch driveway. "Not just that I might have to leave, but that maybe I didn't deserve the kind of life we've built here. Maybe I was fooling myself about belonging somewhere." Marcus stopped the truck and turned to face Daniel directly. "You belong here because this is your home and I'm your father. Not because of legal documents or court decisions, but because that's who we are to each other. Nothing will ever change that." The weeks following the court hearing brought a gradual return to normal routines, but also a deeper appreciation for the family bonds they'd created. Daniel's confidence returned, his sleep improved, and his focus on future plans intensified. The legal challenge had reminded both of them how precious their relationship was and how important it was to nurture and protect what they'd built together. Christmas that year was more meaningful than ever, celebrated with the knowledge that their family was permanent and secure. Emma's visit brought additional perspective on how much they'd both grown during the crisis. She noted that Daniel had matured in ways that went beyond his years, developing the kind of resilience that would serve him well in whatever challenges lay ahead. "You handled that legal situation like an adult," Emma told Daniel as they worked together preparing Christmas dinner. "You knew what you wanted, you articulated it clearly, and you didn't let fear make your decisions for you. That's impressive for someone your age." The new year brought renewed focus on Daniel's final semester of high school and his transition to college. The scholarship to Montana State was confirmed, and his acceptance to the agricultural business program opened possibilities for summer internships that would enhance both his education and his contributions to the ranch operation. "I want to spend this summer developing a 5-year business plan for the ranch," Daniel told Marcus as they reviewed college course schedules. "I've been thinking about diversification opportunities, maybe adding some specialty crops or expanding into organic certification." The conversation revealed how completely Daniel had embraced his role as a future partner in the ranch operation. His ideas were sophisticated and well-researched, reflecting the business education he was already receiving and the practical experience he'd gained through hands-on work. February brought the first concrete steps toward implementing some of Daniel's expansion ideas. They applied for organic certification, began planning for a small specialty crop operation, and researched equipment upgrades that would improve efficiency while maintaining their commitment to sustainable practices. "The organic market is growing faster than conventional beef markets," Daniel explained as he presented his research to Marcus. "If we can get certified and maintain our quality standards, we could command premium prices that would justify the additional labor and certification costs." March brought Daniel's 18th birthday, a milestone that was both celebratory and poignant. Legally, Daniel was now an adult who could make his own decisions about where to live and what to do with his future, but emotionally and practically, he was more committed than ever to his life on the ranch and his role in the Henley family. The birthday celebration was a community affair that demonstrated how completely Daniel had been accepted in Cedar Valley. Neighbors, teachers, and friends gathered at the ranch house to mark not just Daniel's coming of age, but his successful transition from foster child to integral community member. "When Daniel first arrived here, I wasn't sure how it would work out," Tom Bradshaw said during the birthday dinner, "but watching him grow into the young man he's become has been one of the most inspiring things I've witnessed in my 40 years of ranching." April brought Daniel's final high school rodeo competition, an event that showcased skills he'd developed entirely during his time on the ranch. His performance in both riding and cattle handling events earned him regional recognition and scholarship opportunities he hadn't previously considered. "You've got natural talent that most riders never develop," the rodeo coach told Daniel after his final competition. "If you were interested in pursuing this seriously, you could probably compete at the college level." But Daniel's focus remained on agricultural studies and ranch management. The rodeo skills were valuable for practical ranch work, but his long-term goals centered on building a sustainable and profitable operation that would honor the traditions of the past, while embracing the innovations of the future. May brought graduation preparations and the realization that Daniel's high school years were ending exactly as they should, with academic achievement, community recognition, and clear direction for the future. The young man who had arrived at the ranch with nothing but a duffel bag was graduating as valedictorian of his class, recipient of multiple scholarships and acknowledged leader among his peers. Daniel Henley represents the best of what rural education can achieve, Principal Chen said during graduation practice. He's proven that with the right support and opportunities, any young person can excel regardless of their background or circumstances. As graduation day approached, Marcus reflected on the transformation that had occurred in both their lives over the past 2.5 years. The struggling rancher who had taken in a foster child out of loneliness and desperation had become a successful businessman and devoted father. The guarded teenager who had expected another temporary placement had become a confident young man with deep roots and clear purpose. Standing in the kitchen where they'd shared so many important conversations, Marcus realized that the ranch house, that had once echoed with loneliness, now rang with the sounds of a family preparing for a future filled with possibility and promise. Graduation day arrived with the kind of brilliant Montana sunshine that made the valley look like a postcard. Daniel stood at his bedroom window, adjusting the tie that felt foreign after years of ranch work clothes, watching neighbors and friends arrive for the ceremony that would mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The transformation was complete but not visible in any single moment. Looking at Daniel now, confident, articulate, with the bearing of someone who knew exactly where he belonged, it was hard to remember the guarded teenager who had arrived with nothing but a duffel bag and a lifetime of disappointed expectations. "You ready for this?" Marcus asked, appearing in the doorway wearing the suit he'd purchased specifically for the occasion. "More ready than I've ever been for anything," Daniel replied, his voice carrying the certainty that had replaced the careful hesitation of earlier years. The graduation ceremony took place in the Cedar Valley High School gymnasium, decorated with the school colors and filled with families celebrating children who would soon scatter to colleges, jobs, and adventures beyond the valley. But Daniel's presence on the stage as valedictorian represented something deeper than academic achievement. It was proof that every child deserves the chance to discover their potential when given the right environment and support. His valedictorian speech, delivered with the poise of someone who had learned to trust his own voice, focused on themes of belonging, perseverance, and the power of community to transform lives. He spoke about the importance of giving people second chances, about the way that love and stability could help anyone overcome the obstacles that seemed insurmountable. 2.5 years ago, I thought I was broken, Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium. I thought that my past had determined my future, that the circumstances of my birth and early childhood had set limits on what I could achieve. But this community, this family, this place taught me that we're not defined by where we come from. We're defined by what we choose to do with the opportunities we're given. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as he listened. To Daniel acknowledged the ranch, the community, and their family as the foundation for everything he'd accomplished. But more than that, he heard Daniel accepting responsibility for his own success, recognizing that while others had provided support and opportunity, he had made the choices that led to this moment. I want to thank Marcus Henley, who took a chance on a kid who had every reason to expect disappointment, Daniel continued. He didn't just give me a home, he gave me a future. He showed me that family isn't about biology or legal documents. It's about commitment and love and choosing to care about someone else's success as much as your own. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Marcus barely heard it. He was thinking about the phone call that had changed everything, about the decision to attend a placement event that had seemed like desperation at the time, but had turned out to be the best choice he'd ever made. After the ceremony, the reception at the ranch brought together everyone who had been part of Daniel's journey. Teachers who had helped him catch up academically, neighbors who had welcomed him into the community, and friends who had accepted him without question about his background or circumstances. Emma had driven from Seattle bringing photo albums and stories that helped Daniel understand his place in the extended family history. You know what impressed me most about Daniel? Principal Chen said during the informal speeches that followed dinner. It wasn't his academic ability, though that was considerable. It was his character. He never asked for special treatment because of his background, but he also never let anyone else's limitations define what he could achieve. Dr. Carver, who had witnessed Daniel's transformation from the beginning, spoke about the importance of stability and consistency in helping children recover from trauma. Daniel's success isn't just about his own resilience, though that's been remarkable. It's about what happens when a community decides to invest in a child's potential rather than being limited by their circumstances. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Daniel found himself alone with Marcus on the front porch, where they'd shared so many important conversations. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to celebrate the day's significance. "I have something for you," Marcus said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "Consider it a graduation gift." Inside the envelope was a deed transferring half ownership of the ranch to Daniel, along with a letter explaining Marcus's decision. The document represented more than legal partnership. It was formal recognition of Daniel's role as heir and future steward of the land that had shaped both their lives. "I don't know what to say," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion as he read the deed. "Say you'll take care of it," Marcus replied. "Say you'll remember that this land has been in our family for almost a century, and that you'll pass it on to the next generation in better condition than you found it." The word generation hung in the air between them, carrying implications about marriage, children, and a future that stretched far beyond their current circumstances. Daniel was only 18, but Marcus could already see the man he would become: steady, responsible, committed to the values that had guided the Henley family for generations. June brought the final preparations for Daniel's departure to Montana State University. The summer months would be split between college orientation activities and ranch work, allowing him to maintain his connection to the land while beginning his formal education in agricultural business and animal science. The dual major program would be demanding, but Daniel approached it with the same methodical determination that had characterized his approach to ranch work. He'd already identified professors whose research aligned with his interests, and he'd arranged internships that would provide practical experience to complement his academic studies. "I want to spend my first summer break developing a comprehensive business plan for the ranch's next 5 years, Daniel told Marcus as they reviewed his class schedule. "I've been researching sustainable farming practices, organic certification requirements, and market opportunities for specialty beef products." The conversation revealed how completely Daniel had embraced his role as a partner in the ranch operation. His ideas were sophisticated and well-researched, incorporating both traditional ranching wisdom and modern agricultural innovations. Marcus found himself learning from Daniel's research and perspectives, creating a partnership that benefited both their individual knowledge and their shared goals. July brought a visit from Janet Morrison, who had continued to check on Daniel's progress even after the adoption was finalized. Her visit was partly professional, completing final paperwork for state records, but mostly personal, as she wanted to witness firsthand the success story that had emerged from what had initially seemed like a challenging placement. "In 20 years of social work, I've rarely seen a placement work out as well as this one," Janet told Marcus, as they watched Daniel working with the horses in the pasture below. "Both of you found exactly what you needed in each other, and the results speak for themselves." The conversation that followed covered the broader implications of Daniel's success story. Janet explained that his case was being used as an example in training programs for social workers, demonstrating the importance of matching children with families based on compatibility rather than just convenience. "Too often, we focus on what children can't do because of their backgrounds," Janet explained. "Daniel's story shows what happens when we focus on potential instead of problems. when we provide stability and opportunity rather than just temporary care. August brought Daniel's first experience with college life, though he remained deeply connected to the ranch through weekend visits and summer work. The adjustment to dormitory living and university coursework was challenging, but Daniel approached it with the same resilience he'd shown in adapting to ranch life. His professors quickly recognized his combination of practical experience and academic ability, recommending him for research opportunities that would enhance both his education and his contributions to the ranch operation. The agricultural business program provided exactly the kind of training Daniel needed to implement his expansion plans. "Your son has an unusual combination of theoretical knowledge and practical experience," Professor William Hayes told Marcus during a parent conference. "Most of our students have one or the other, but Daniel brings both, plus the kind of work ethic that's becoming rare in his generation." September brought the implementation of Daniel's first major contribution to the ranch's development. The organic certification process he'd researched and planned was officially approved, allowing them to market their beef as certified organic and command premium prices that reflected their sustainable practices. The certification required extensive documentation and adherence to strict standards, but Daniel had prepared thoroughly for the requirements. His attention to detail and systematic approach to record-keeping impressed the certification inspectors and ensured that the transition proceeded smoothly. "This is just the beginning," Daniel told Marcus, as they reviewed the financial projections for organic beef sales. "Once we establish our reputation in the organic market, we can expand into other specialty products, grass-fed beef, heritage, breed cattle, maybe even direct-to-consumer sales." October brought the first anniversary of Daniel's graduation and the completion of his first year of college. The milestone prompted reflection on how much had changed since that uncertain teenager had first arrived at the ranch placement event. Daniel was now a confident young man with clear goals and the skills to achieve them. The ranch operation had expanded and diversified under Daniel's influence, but more importantly, it had regained the sense of purpose and continuity that had been missing since Sarah's death. The empty rooms that had once echoed with loneliness now filled with the sounds of planning sessions, study groups, and the comfortable conversations of a family working toward shared goals. "You know what I realized?" Daniel said one evening as they reviewed the ranch's financial reports. "When I first came here, I thought you were rescuing me. But really, we rescued each other." Marcus smiled, recognizing the truth in Daniel's observation. The ranch that had seemed like a burden threatening to destroy his future had become a gift to be shared with someone who appreciated its value. Daniel, who had arrived expecting another temporary placement, had found a permanent home and a future that stretched as far as the Montana horizon. November brought news that would touch the entire community and demonstrate the ripple effects of Daniel's success story. The state announced a new initiative to expand rural placement programs, using the Henley Ranch placement as a model for matching children with families in agricultural communities. "Your success has inspired changes in how we approach placement decisions," Janet Morrison explained during a visit to discuss the new program. "We're now prioritizing compatibility and shared interests rather than just geographic convenience." The new program would bring additional foster children to rural communities throughout Montana, providing opportunities for other young people to experience the kind of stability and purpose that had transformed Daniel's life. Marcus and Daniel were asked to serve as mentors for other families considering similar placements. "It's our responsibility to help other kids find what I found here," Daniel said when they discussed their potential involvement in the program. "Not everyone will want ranch life, but every kid deserves the chance to discover where they belong." December brought the second Christmas they would celebrate as a legally recognized family, but the third Christmas they would share as father. and son. The holiday took on special significance as they reflected on the journey that had brought them together and the future they were building together. Emma's visit brought news of her own. She was engaged to a fellow nurse and planning a wedding that would take place at the ranch the following summer. The prospect of hosting a family wedding filled both Marcus and Daniel with excitement and pride, cementing their role as the family's Montana homestead. "I want Daniel to walk me down the aisle with Dad," Emma announced during Christmas dinner. "He's my brother now, and I want him to be part of the ceremony." The inclusion in such an important family moment moved Daniel to tears, representing the complete acceptance and belonging he'd never experienced before coming to the ranch. The teenager who had arrived expecting rejection had become an integral part of family traditions and celebrations. January brought the beginning of Daniel's second semester at Montana State and the implementation of additional ranch improvements he'd planned during winter break. The expansion was proceeding ahead of schedule, generating additional income that would support further growth while maintaining the sustainable practices that had become central to their operation. The success of their organic certification had attracted attention from other ranchers interested in similar transitions, leading to consulting opportunities that would provide additional income while spreading sustainable practices throughout the region. Daniel's expertise, despite his youth, was increasingly recognized and sought after. Who would have thought that a kid from foster care would become an expert that other ranchers come to for advice? Tom Bradshaw observed during one of his visits. Daniel's knowledge and approach to ranching are impressive at any age, but especially for someone who's only been doing this for 3 years. February brought the completion of Daniel's business plan for the ranch's 5-year expansion, a comprehensive document that outlined strategies for growth while maintaining their commitment to sustainable practices and animal welfare. The plan was sophisticated enough to attract interest from agricultural lenders and investors. This is the kind of forward-thinking approach that modern ranching requires, the loan officer at the Regional Agricultural Bank told Marcus as they reviewed Daniel's projections. "You're fortunate to have a partner who understands both the traditional aspects of ranching and the business innovations that will be necessary for future success." March brought Daniel's 19th birthday and the announcement that he'd been selected for a prestigious summer internship program at the Department of Agriculture. The internship would provide valuable experience in agricultural policy and regulation, while allowing him to maintain his connection to the ranch through weekend visits. This internship could open doors to opportunities we haven't even considered, Daniel told Marcus as they discussed his plans. "But no matter what possibilities emerge, my commitment is to this ranch and our family. This is where I belong, and this is where I want to build my future." As spring arrived in the valley, bringing new life to the pastures and renewal to the land, Marcus reflected on the transformation that had occurred in both their lives. The struggling rancher who had taken in a foster child out of desperation had become a successful businessman and devoted father. The guarded teenager who had expected disappointment had become a confident young man with deep roots and clear purpose. Standing on the front porch where Daniel had first arrived, almost 4 years earlier, Marcus watched his son working with the cattle in the distance. The young man's movements were confident and purposeful, reflecting the deep connection to the land and animals that had become central to his identity. The ranch that had once seemed like a burden threatening to destroy Marcus's future had become a legacy to be shared with someone who understood its value and was committed to its success. Daniel, who had arrived with nothing but a duffel bag and a lifetime of disappointed expectations, had become the heir to a tradition that stretched back 4 generations and would continue for generations to come. The transformation was complete, but the story was far from over. As Daniel looked toward a future that included college graduation, career development, and eventually a family of his own, Marcus knew that the ranch would continue to flourish under his stewardship. The land that had shaped both their lives would continue to shape future generations, providing the same stability, purpose, and belonging that had saved them both. In the end, the struggling rancher who took in a small orphan had done more than provide a home. He'd created a family. And the small orphan who had been given a chance had done more than find stability. He'd found his calling, his purpose, and his place in a tradition that would continue long after both of them were gone. The entire town of Cedar Valley had witnessed this transformation, and in doing so, had learned something profound about the power of love, commitment, and the belief that every person deserves the chance to discover their potential when given the right environment and support. 5 years had passed since Daniel's graduation, and the changes that had begun with one man's decision to help a struggling teenager had rippled outward in ways that neither Marcus nor Daniel could have imagined. The ranch now served as headquarters for the Montana Rural Youth Placement Initiative, a statewide program that had successfully placed over 200 children in agricultural communities across the state. Daniel, now 23 and recently graduated from Montana State, with degrees in both agricultural business and animal science, had returned to the ranch as a full partner in the operation. But his role extended far beyond cattle and land management. He had become the face of a movement that was transforming how society approached the care of children who needed homes. The morning sun cast long shadows across the expanded ranch facilities as Daniel conducted his weekly video conference with social workers from across Montana. The conference room, built in what had once been an unused section of the barn, hosted representatives from 12 counties who gathered virtually to discuss placement opportunities and success stories. The Henderson family in Glacier County has been approved for their second placement, reported Linda Martinez, a social worker from Kalispell. The first child they took in 3 years ago is now preparing for college, and they want to help another teenager who's interested in learning. Forestry management, Daniel smiled as he reviewed the case file on his tablet. The Henderson placement had been one of the first successes of the expanded program, proving that the model could work beyond the specific circumstances that had brought him to the Henley Ranch. Each successful placement validated the approach and created advocates for further expansion. "What about the Rodriguez application from Billings County?" Daniel asked, pulling up another file. "They have experience with horses and want to work with a child who's expressed interest in equine therapy." The conversation that followed demonstrated the sophisticated matching process that had evolved from the original placement event. Rather than emergency placements driven by system overload, the program now took time to carefully match children's interests and backgrounds with families whose lifestyles and values aligned with their needs. After the conference, Daniel walked through the ranch facilities that had been transformed by success and growth. The original house remained the family center, but additional buildings had been added to accommodate the training programs, workshops, and conferences that brought people from across the region to learn about rural youth placement. The cattle operation had expanded to over 300 head, all certified organic and grass-fed, commanding premium prices that supported both the ranch's growth and the funding of placement programs. Daniel's business acumen, combined with Marcus's operational experience, had created an enterprise that was both profitable and socially meaningful. "The documentary crew from PBS is arriving this afternoon," Marcus said, joining Daniel near the main barn. "They want to film the mentorship session with the Johnson family from Great Falls." The PBS documentary was the latest in a series of media features that had brought national attention to the Montana Rural Youth Placement Initiative. The story of a struggling rancher and an orphaned teenager had captured public imagination. But more importantly, it had inspired similar programs in other states facing foster care challenges. "Are you ready for this level of attention?" Marcus asked, noting the mix of excitement and nervousness in Daniel's expression. "I think so," Daniel replied. "If telling our story helps other kids find homes like I found here, then it's worth being uncomfortable about the spotlight." The afternoon brought the arrival of the Johnson family. Parents Jim and Carol, along with 16-year-old Tyler, the teenager they had recently welcomed into their home. Tyler's background was similar to Daniel's in some ways: multiple foster placements, academic potential hampered by instability, and a wariness about trusting adults who promised permanence. "Tyler's been with us for 4 months now," Carol Johnson explained as the PBS crew set up their cameras. "He's doing well in school and has taken to ranch work like he was born to it, but he still has moments where he seems to expect everything to fall apart." Daniel nodded, remembering his own struggle to believe that good things could be permanent. "That's normal. It takes time to trust that stability is real when you've experienced so much instability. The key is consistency, showing up every day, keeping promises, being patient with the process." The mentorship session that followed was filmed but felt natural and unforced. Daniel shared his own experiences with Tyler, not as someone dispensing advice from a position of authority, but as someone who had walked a similar path and could offer perspective on the journey. "When I first came here, I kept waiting for Marcus to get tired of dealing with me," Daniel told Tyler as they worked together repairing fence posts. "I thought every mistake I made might be the one that caused him to send me away. It took months before I really believed this was my home." Tyler's response was hesitant but genuine. "How did you know? When did you stop waiting for it to end?" "I think it was gradual," Daniel reflected, pausing in his work to consider the question carefully. "But there was a moment during my first winter here when I got sick, and Marcus took care of me without making it seem like a burden. That's when I started to understand that family isn't about being perfect. It's about caring for each other through difficult times." The conversation revealed the depth of understanding Daniel had developed about the psychology of placement and the importance of patience in helping traumatized children learn to trust. His insights, born from personal experience rather than academic study, provided guidance that was both practical and emotionally authentic. The PBS crew captured not just the conversation between Daniel and Tyler, but the broader context of ranch life that provided structure and purpose for young people who had often lacked both. The physical demands of caring for animals, the seasonal rhythms of agricultural work, and the clear connection between effort and results created an environment where healing could occur naturally. "What we're seeing here isn't just about finding homes for children," the documentary director observed during a break in filming. "It's about creating communities that understand their responsibility to nurture the next generation, regardless of biological connections." Evening brought a community gathering that had become a monthly tradition, a potluck dinner where families involved in the placement program shared experiences, challenges, and successes. The gathering was held in the community center that had been built with funding from the ranch's success and donations from supporters across the country. The crowd that filled the community center represented a cross-section of rural Montana life, but with a common thread of commitment to helping children find permanent homes. Ranchers, farmers, small business owners, and retirees who had opened their homes to young people who needed families created a support network that extended far beyond individual placements. 5 years ago, we had one success story, Mayor Patricia. Gonzalez addressed the crowd. "Tonight, we're celebrating over 60 successful placements in our county alone, with dozens more in progress. What started as an emergency response to a crisis has become a model for communities across the nation." The statistics were impressive, but the real measure of success was visible in the faces around the room. Teenagers who had found stability and purpose, adults who had discovered the joy of nurturing young lives, and communities that had been strengthened by their commitment to caring for vulnerable children. Daniel was asked to speak, a role he had initially resisted, but had grown to embrace, as he understood the power of sharing his story. His remarks were brief but powerful, focusing on the ripple effects of one person's decision to help. "Marcus didn't just save my life when he took me in," Daniel told the crowd. "He started something that has touched hundreds of lives and will continue to touch hundreds more. Every child who finds a home through this program, every family that opens their hearts to someone who needs love, all of it traces back to one person's willingness to take a chance on someone else." The applause that followed was sustained and emotional, but Daniel's attention was focused on Tyler Johnson, whose expression showed the first glimmer of hope that he too might find the kind of belonging that Daniel had discovered. After the gathering, as families headed home across the dark Montana landscape, Daniel and Marcus found themselves alone on the ranch house porch, looking out over land that had been transformed by their partnership. The comfortable silence between them spoke to the deep bond that had developed over years of shared work and mutual respect. "Emma called today," Marcus said finally. "She and James are expecting their first child." The news filled Daniel with excitement and a profound sense of continuity. Emma's baby would be the fifth generation to grow up connected to the Henley Ranch, carrying forward traditions that had survived depression, drought, and the near loss of everything the family had built. "Boy or girl?" Daniel asked. "Too early to tell, but Emma said they're hoping to spend summers here so the baby can grow up understanding ranch life," Marcus replied. "She wants her children to have the same connection to the land that shaped our family." The conversation that followed covered practical matters, converting one of the upstairs bedrooms into a nursery, child-proofing areas of the ranch that would soon host curious toddlers, and the joy of imagining the house filled with children's voices again. But underneath the logistics was a deeper recognition of what they had built together. The ranch that had once seemed destined to end with Marcus's generation would now continue with Daniel as its steward, supported by Emma's children and eventually by the family Daniel would create. "I've been thinking about asking Sarah Chen to marry me," Daniel said quietly, referring to the young woman he had dated since high school and who had recently completed her degree in environmental science. Marcus's smile was radiant. "Sarah's a wonderful choice. She understands ranch life, and she cares about the same things you do. Have you talked to her about what that would mean for the ranch?" "She wants to be part of it," Daniel replied. "She's interested in developing sustainable practices that could serve as models for other operations. She sees the ranch as a place where environmental conservation and agricultural productivity can work together." The prospect of Daniel's marriage represented more than personal happiness. It meant the continuation of family traditions and the expansion of the ranch's mission to include environmental stewardship alongside youth placement programs. Winter arrived early that year, but the ranch was prepared in ways that would have seemed impossible during Marcus's years of struggle before Daniel's arrival. Modern equipment, improved facilities, and a clear succession plan meant that seasonal challenges were manageable rather than threatening. The first major snowfall brought a crisis that tested all the lessons learned over years of partnership. A sudden temperature drop trapped a section of cattle in a remote pasture, creating conditions similar to the emergency that had first proved Daniel's commitment to the ranch. But this time, the response was coordinated and efficient. Daniel led a rescue team that included Tyler Johnson and 2 other teenagers from recent placements, demonstrating how skills and values were being passed to a new generation of young people who understood their responsibility to care for animals and land. Tyler did excellent work during the rescue, Daniel reported to the Johnson family afterward. He stayed calm under pressure, followed instructions precisely, and showed genuine concern for the animals' welfare. Those are qualities that can't be taught. They have to come from the heart. The successful rescue operation was covered by local media, highlighting not just the immediate success, but the broader story of how the ranch had become a training ground for young people learning responsibility, teamwork, and compassion. Spring brought the announcement that the Montana Rural Youth Placement Initiative had been selected as a model for a federal pilot program that would expand similar approaches to other states. Daniel was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee about the program's success and the factors that made rural placements effective. The key is understanding that children need more than shelter and supervision, Daniel told the congressional panel. They need purpose, connection to something bigger than themselves, and adults who believe in their potential. Rural communities can provide all of those things when they're committed to welcoming young people as full members rather than temporary visitors. The federal recognition brought additional funding and support, but also the responsibility of maintaining quality while expanding scale. Daniel worked with university researchers to develop training materials and evaluation methods that would ensure new programs maintained the standards that had made the Montana Initiative successful. Summer brought Daniel's wedding to Sarah Chen, held on the ranch with friends and family gathered from across the region. The ceremony took place in the meadow where Daniel had first learned to work with cattle, surrounded by the mountains and grasslands that had shaped his understanding of home and belonging. The wedding reception filled the ranch house and spilled onto the surrounding grounds, creating the kind of celebration that rural communities do best, unpretentious, inclusive, and focused on relationships rather than ceremony. Children from recent placements served as ushers and greeters, demonstrating how completely they had been integrated into the extended family that the ranch represented. Daniel's journey from foster child to community leader shows what's possible when we invest in young people's potential, Principal Chen said during his toast to the couple. But more than that, it shows how healing occurs through purpose and belonging rather than just time and good intentions. As autumn arrived, bringing the familiar rhythms of cattle management and preparation for winter, Daniel and Sarah settled into married life while continuing to expand the ranch's impact. Sarah's environmental science background proved invaluable in developing conservation practices that enhanced both the land's productivity and its ecological health. The year's final major event was the 5th anniversary celebration of the Montana Rural Youth Placement Initiative, hosted at the ranch, with families, social workers, and supporters gathering to celebrate successes and plan for continued growth. The statistics were impressive. Over 400 successful placements, a retention rate exceeding 90%, and measurable improvements in academic achievement, emotional stability, and future prospects for participating children. But the real measure of success was visible in the faces around the celebration. Young people who had found homes, adults who had discovered the joy of nurturing the next generation, and communities that had been strengthened by their commitment to caring for vulnerable children. What started as one man's decision to help one child has become a movement that's changing lives across our state and inspiring similar efforts nationally, Governor Patricia Williams said during her remarks at the celebration. The Henley Ranch represents the best of Montana values: independence, responsibility, and the understanding that we're all connected to each other and to the land that sustains us. As the celebration concluded and guests departed across the darkening landscape, Daniel stood with Marcus and Sarah on the porch where so many important conversations had taken place. The ranch house glowed with warm light, and the sounds of contentment, cattle settling for the night, horses moving peacefully in their pastures, created a symphony of successful stewardship. "Did you ever imagine it would become this?" Sarah asked, gesturing toward the facilities that now supported not just their family and ranch operation, but a program that was transforming how society cared for vulnerable children. "Never," Marcus replied honestly. "I thought I was just helping one kid who needed a home. I had no idea we were starting something that would touch so many lives." Daniel smiled, thinking about Tyler Johnson and the dozens of other young people who had found stability and purpose through the program they had created. Each success story validated the approach and created advocates for further expansion, ensuring that the work would continue long after any of them were directly involved. "The beautiful thing is that it's bigger than any of us now," Daniel observed. "We've created something that will continue growing and helping people regardless of what happens to us individually. That's the best kind of legacy, one that serves others long after you're gone." As they stood together, looking out over the ranch that had been transformed by love, commitment, and the belief that every person deserves the chance to discover their potential, they could see lights in windows across the valley where other families were creating their own success stories. The struggling rancher, who had taken in a small orphan, had indeed brought an entire community to tears. Tears of joy, hope, and pride in what people could accomplish when they chose to care for one another. The story that had begun with desperation and uncertainty had become a testament to the power of love to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities committed to nurturing the next generation. And in ranch houses across Montana and beyond, other families were beginning their own chapters of the same eternal story. The story of how broken things could be made whole when people chose to believe in each other's potential for healing and growth. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.